e kawana te nako kua tāmai kato. Ki te whakanui I te kaupapa o te rā, no reira. E ka rangatira. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. A very warm welcome to you all, those of you who are here in person and those who are joining us from around New Zealand, Australia and further afield, including England, America and Canada. And particular warm welcome, of course, to Jane's family who are here this evening, and to some special friends who can't be here but would love to be, particularly Professor Geoffrey Robinson, a long-standing friend and mentor of Jane's, who's joining us from Adelaide. My name is Frank Bloomfield. I'm Director of the Liggins Institute, and it's my pleasure to be the MC for this evening's special lecture in recognition of distinguished Professor Jane Harding's promotion to Dame Companion of the New Zealand Order of Merit. Before we start this evening, just a few housekeeping announcements. The exits are, of course, those you came in through, and two additional ones at the front. In the event of an emergency, there'll be red flashing lights and a very loud siren, which you won't be able to ignore, believe me. So please just make your way out of the building, either through the doors at the back or at the front here, and out through the main entrance of this building and congregate in the open space out of the front. Bathrooms are located in the corridor down to the right as you go out of the lecture theatre, or diagonally across the atrium in sort of that direction over there. Please do turn off your cell phones, or if you really must keep them on, please turn them to silent. The lecture is being recorded this evening and will be available on our website afterwards. There won't be any questions after the lecture, but for those of you who would like to, we're very warm welcome to join us afterwards for a chat at the reception. And for those of you who are on Zoom, if you do have burning questions for Jane, I'm sure she'll be only too delighted to answer them if you email them to her. Jane doesn't get enough emails. I've had the privilege of knowing distinguished Professor Dame Jane Harding since my first day at work here in New Zealand almost 26 years ago. Initially as a registrar and a fellow, then as one of Jane's early PhD students, then as a colleague both at National Women's Hospital and here at the University of Auckland, and finally in my current role as Director of the Liggins Institute, which puts me in the rather bizarre position of normally being Jane's boss. Many others here have also experienced the privilege not only of working with Jane, but of being at the receiving end of her constant support, mentorship, wisdom, consideration, and occasionally the look, which is difficult to explain, but once experienced, never forgotten. Dame Jane inspires admiration, awe, respect and loyalty, perhaps most of all, in all of those who work with her. And this is as much to do with the quiet, unspoken and considered contributions she makes behind the scenes as to the stellar contributions she has made to neonatology, research, the university and the wider community that have deservedly led to so many honours and accolades. After returning from Oxford, where Jane went as a Rhodes Scholar to take a DPhil, and then from a postdoctoral position at the University of California, San Francisco, Jane worked as a neonatologist across the road at National Women's Hospital, which of course then was next to Cornwall Park, for many years providing an exemplar of evidence-based care, whilst also working as an academic at the University of Auckland. Her research spans experimental studies, clinical trials, world-class follow-up, research synthesis and translation, and has advanced their understanding of the development of the fetus and the newborn and changed neonatal care around the world. Jane has also served as Deputy Vice-Chancellor of the University of Auckland, overseeing a dramatic rise in its external research income and its research outputs. She is New Zealand's Secretary of the Rhodes Trust, has served on many councils and committees and boards, including serving as President of the Perinatal Society of New Zealand and as President of the Perinatal Society of Australia and New Zealand. And I welcome the current president and past presidents of that society who have zoomed in this evening, and all the other members of those societies. The excellence of Jane's research has been recognised through the award of the Health Research Council's Bevan Medal for Translational Research, the Gluckman Medal for Outstanding Contributions to the Faculty of Medical and Health Sciences, the Howard Williams Medal of the Royal Australasian College of Physicians, the Norman J. Siegel Outstanding Science Award from the American Paediatric Society, the first time that award has ever been given to anyone outside of the United States, and the Royal Society Te Aparangi's Rutherford Medal, New Zealand's most prestigious science award. Her wider contributions have been acknowledged through election to the Fellowship of the Royal Society of New Zealand Te Aparangi, appointment as an officer of the New Zealand Order of Merit, North and South New Zealander of the Year Award, New Zealand Women of Influence Supreme Winner in 2019, and now promotion to Dame Companion of the New Zealand Order of Merit. Jane, it's been an absolute privilege to witness many of these contributions close hand and to have been both a colleague and a friend for so many years. And I now invite you to tell us how it all starts with babies. Please join me in welcoming Distinguished Professor Dame Jane Hardy.
Thank you, Frank, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming or Zooming, depending on where you are. This has been a really strange lecture to prepare for. It's not an inaugural lecture to celebrate a new professor. It's not yet a valedictory lecture to end a career. In fact, I'm not at all sure it's a lecture that's meant to happen. The weekend that this award was announced, my mother very sensibly said to me, "At least you don't have to give a lecture for this one." That was very shortly before I got a text from Frank saying, "I thought we'd have a lecture." So tonight I've chosen to take this as an opportunity to look back, to tell you a bit more personal about the journey, to tell you a bit about the process of acquiring some of those strange letters after my name, and to share some of the wonderful opportunities and privileges that have made it possible, as well as to thank some of the huge number of people who've been part of the journey. I think I was probably always interested in science and trying things out and experiments. I do somewhat remember my family generously complying when I'd read somewhere that people got shorter during the day, and I lined them all up and measured them morning and night. It was true. I think I was about 9 at the time. But I also wonder if my early fascination with growth and development was partly precipitated by the arrival of a baby brother. And I was absolutely fascinated with his growth. How did it happen and why? It just seemed completely miraculous. It still does. I applied for medicine, although I wasn't ever sure why that was. I didn't know what doctors did. I didn't have any role models, but my parents and my teachers at school were endlessly supportive, somewhat bewildered perhaps, but at least supportive, and I was very grateful for that. So I came to medical school in Auckland. It was a new medical school at that time. And I studied medicine, and looking back, I realised that a number of the projects I did at medical school had to do with nutrition and growth. Funny that. And although I'd started medical school thinking I was going to be a pathologist, by the time I was in 5th year, I was definitely going to be a GP in Taranaki. But things changed. And one rather daunting day, I was summoned by the dean. That's always rather scary when you're a student. I was invited, or more accurately persuaded, to apply for a Rhodes Scholarship. I wasn't at all sure I wanted it, and I wouldn't have applied without a lot of support from many people. But it was an opportunity not to be missed, and I've learnt, and we'll come back to that opportunities are not to be missed. So off I went to Oxford with a new title and some letters after my name. And I decided that this was an opportunity to do something quite different, and I wouldn't do clinical work. I would do research. I needed a project and a supervisor. And at the time, medical school, one of my teachers was Colin Mantell. Colin had some links to Oxford. He was a senior lecturer. That is to say, he was a clinical academic. He divided his time between clinical practice and research and teaching. And he said to me, "You want a job like mine, don't you?" I still wasn't convinced. But I was interested in growth and nutrition. And Colin introduced me to Geoffrey Dawes, who was the director of the Nuffield Institute and was really the father of fetal physiology. And he in turn introduced me to Geoffrey Robinson, who was my PhD supervisor. And Geoffrey is a kind and wise man who has become a lifelong friend and mentor. He taught me about research and about fetal physiology and a bit about wine along the way. He also told me, and he won't remember this, that I was far too small to take on this peculiarly Oxford sport of rowing. But the study of the fetus while still in the womb was a very new science at that time. And we studied how fetuses grow in sheep. This is actually a photo from my PhD thesis, and you can see we had fetuses that did grow and fetuses that didn't. And we started to understand that it wasn't as simple as glucose going from mother to placenta to fetus. We started to untangle for the first time that actually it was much more complicated, that the placenta was key to the whole arrangement. It converted one sort of nutrients to another, and in fact some nutrients went backwards, back to the placenta, back to the mother. This whole intricate interaction that was needed to make the fetus survive and grow. Well, eventually I did graduate. I now had a DPhil after my name, which is an Oxford PhD. I still didn't have a job. And I'd found research quite a lonely pursuit, fascinating but frustrating. And I missed clinical practice. So I applied for my first house officer jobs in Taranaki, and I came back to New Zealand convinced that I wasn't going to go near a lab again. Lasted about 3 months. I managed to learn which end of the stethoscope was which again after several years out, but I missed research. And more importantly, there were so many questions in clinical practice that didn't have an answer, that needed research to address. I was interested in both obstetrics and paediatrics, and I went to the heads of both departments to inquire about training. Well, the head of obstetrics was discouraging and the head of paediatrics was encouraging, and that's how I ended up to be a paediatrician. Never overestimate how much difference the attitude of teachers can make to a student's career. So I applied for paediatric training and got accepted the same year as one Wayne Cutfield. Paediatrics was wonderful. I loved the inherent anarchy of a children's ward. I loved the families, the engagement with the children, the joys, the tragedies. I loved the fact that children got sick really quickly, but they got better really quickly. And it was such a privilege to be part of that. And these wonderful people taught me to look after newborn babies. To me, that was just applied fetal physiology. I mean, this was just a baby who'd just been born. It was still a fetus if it was preterm, and I already knew quite a lot about fetal physiology and still found it fascinating. So over the next few years, I sat exams and I completed my specialist training, and I acquired some more letters after my name. And I met this man, who was at that time a postdoctoral fellow, recently returned to New Zealand. Peter Gluckman was doing research in sheep. And he helped me find a postdoc role in San Francisco. was a really interesting time to be in San Francisco. It was early in the AIDS epidemic. The very first tools of molecular biology were just being introduced, and the very first Mac computers. They made compulsory classes and all the fellows had to go along to learn to use a Mac computer. It was a very useful thing to learn. So I learnt to sea kayak and I enjoyed the national parks, but I disliked the medical system intensely. I disliked insurance companies telling me how families should be treated. And I wondered from time to time if I'd ever get a job. Because by then, you see, I knew that Colin Mantell had been right. What I really wanted was a job as a senior lecturer, a clinical academic. In fact, I wanted one in neonatology, and there wasn't any. There never had been any. The only clinical academic neonatologist in the whole of Australia and New Zealand was David Henderson Smart. I knew David from Oxford. He was endlessly supportive, a great friend and colleague and mentor. He taught me about collaboration, he taught me about Cochrane, and a bit about wine. And eventually, I did come back to New Zealand to a so-called proper job. I'd been in training for 17 years. I had the incredible privilege of clinical work with babies, of enjoying New Zealand with wonderful friends, some of whom are here or listening tonight, and of course I had the privilege of doing research. Initially, I went back to the problem of what regulates growth of the fetus in sheep. It was still a problem. And we were able to show reasonably convincingly, I think, that clearly nutrition was the major regulator of growth of the fetus, at least in late gestation. And you see here a fetus in the womb, and this is its growth from day to day, and you see the fetus is growing along, and then there's a 10-day period where the mother is undernourished and the fetus simply stops growing. Mother's refed, fetus starts growing again. It was very obvious that nutrition was critical to the regulation of fetal growth. And that turned out to be really important because David Barker, here with his wife Jan, began to publish this kind of data, which says that size at birth turns out to matter a whole lot for your subsequent health. Here you can see that babies, small babies on the left, less than 5 pounds, had a much higher risk of heart disease than the bigger babies on the right. And that's really odd. Why should size at birth predict whether you're going to have a heart attack before 65? David wanted to know what made babies small. Who was working on how babies grow? We were, and the Adelaide group were, with Geoffrey Robinson. So he came to talk to us and to Adelaide to talk to Geoffrey, and we had long conversations. You can see that it was a very serious matter, and eventually led to the first workshop on the fetal origins of adult disease, and that eventually became what is now the International Society for the Developmental Origins of Health and Disease, with which many of you are engaged and which runs international conferences. The trouble with working with sheep, as indeed in any kind of research, is they don't always do what you think they should. And although most fetuses did the kind of thing that I've just shown you at the top, where fetus is growing, 10 days of undernutrition, fetus stops growing, refeed the mother, starts growing again. Some of them did what you see at the bottom, which is to say they just plain kept going. And it took me longer than I'd like to admit to finally work out that the difference was, in fact, what was happening before the undernutrition. You can see that the fetuses on the bottom are growing more slowly before the undernutrition. And they just carried on. And we reasoned that that meant something had happened much earlier in pregnancy that we didn't know about, that had set this up in some way so this fetus could carry on growing. We said, what if something's happened to nutrition of that fetus very early in pregnancy? And we were able to show in a series of experiments that indeed, if the mother was well fed throughout pregnancy, they did what I've shown you on the top there, grew along, stopped, kept growing again, But if we undernourished the mother before and just around the time of conception, just the first month of a 5-month pregnancy, then we had fetuses that grew slowly and didn't respond to late undernutrition. And it turned out that that period of undernutrition just around the time of conception was critical, not only for that fetus, but for the rest of its life. And here are the adult sheep, and you can see that an adult sheep whose mother was undernourished just around the time of conception wasn't able to produce insulin, the filled-in spots, in response to a glucose load. They'd permanently changed their insulin secretion just by that exposure when they were in an embryo. Now, the general manager of National Women's during this period, a new manager came in, and his name was Gary Henry, and for a manager he had this very radical idea that a hospital manager could support excellence by supporting research as well as by supporting clinical practice. And he in fact made it possible to create the very first fellows role at National Women's. And that was filled by a recent English immigrant who told me right at the beginning that he wanted a job like mine. He always had much more sense than I did. He went on to do his PhD, and in his postdoc, he showed that those fetuses that had experienced undernutrition right around the time of conception actually delivered early. The white ones are the ones whose mothers have been well nourished. They all deliver in a very close time period at term. The yellow ones are the ones whose mothers had been undernourished months earlier, and they delivered early. And Frank went on to show that that was because there was an early rise in cortisol. You see on the right here that the normal rise in cortisol, a steroid hormone, immediately before delivery, and that happened earlier in the fetuses that had been undernourished. That shifted the focus of research, what had always been about preterm birth for late gestation, what's happening late in the pregnancy that causes a preterm birth. This was saying, actually, that's not the point. It's way back when this pregnancy starts that we need to worry about. And there's been an increasing focus, lots of human studies showing that that is in fact crucial to lifelong health and preterm birth. One of the people who'd studied the rise in cortisol before birth was Mont Liggins. And Mont Liggins with Ross Howie had been my teachers at medical school. In the 1960s, they were working on sheep, which were indeed in Cornwall Park, next to the old National Women's Hospital. And Mont was studying what triggered the onset of labour. And he managed to show very elegantly that if you stopped that rise in cortisol, labour didn't happen. And if you gave steroids early, the sheep went into labour and delivered a preterm lamb. And those preterm lambs always died. They died of lung disease because their lungs were immature. The remarkable thing about these experiments was not that this was the onset of labour, because it turns out it's not what happens in people, but the observation that he made in this paper in 1969, that if you gave steroids to the sheep, you got accelerated maturation of the lungs. And these lambs, which had always died, some of them survived. Well, they reasoned that if it worked in lambs, it would probably work in people, and they went on to do the very first randomised trial of antenatal steroids for women at risk of preterm labour to accelerate maturation of the baby's lungs. It was a landmark trial, over 1,000 women, and it showed really dramatic benefits. There aren't many things in medicine that reduce mortality that much and reduce lung disease that much. That was in 1972. So we, National Women's, started using antenatal steroids. Lots of other people did more trials. And in fact, they kept doing more trials through the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s. They were still doing trials. And the answer was exactly the same. The relative risks down the right, or where the spots are on the graph, you can see they're all much in the same place. Why were people keeping doing trials instead of using this life-saving therapy? Partly because they were worried about side effects. They were worried that these potent drugs, steroids are very potent drugs that have lots of side effects. Surely exposing a baby to steroids before birth was going to be bad for them. There was bound to be some long-term consequences of this. And we realised that there was only one way to find out. I had the privilege of knowing both Peter and Mont was very supportive of us thinking about this problem, and I'm very fond of this particular photograph because here we're actually celebrating my election to the Fellowship of the Royal Society and Peter's award of the Rutherford Medal. And it was about this time I started thinking that actually acquiring letters was a bit like, a piece of driftwood floating around in the sea. You just kept acquiring barnacles. If you stay in this milieu for long enough, you acquire more letters or something. When I came back to New Zealand, I'd moved into the office at National Women's that had been Ross Howie's. And locked in a cupboard were the old handwritten records of that first clinical trial. And it was obvious the only way we were going to put to rest the question of whether there were long-term consequences of exposure to steroids was to find those people and see how they were years later. We didn't actually know the name of the baby we were trying to find. We knew the name of the mother and the date of birth and sex of the baby, and they were now 30. It's quite hard to find a 30-year-old when you don't know their name. But we did. And here you can see Mont and Ross, who were very generous in sharing their data and supporting us to do this. David Barker, who thought the answer was obvious, of course there were going to be adverse effects. And one Stuart Dalziel, who was a paediatric trainee who agreed to come join the team and do his PhD doing the long-term follow-up of that study. Well, were there adverse effects? No, there were not. There were no effect on 30-year-olds that we could detect on all of these things that might have been possible consequences of exposure to steroids. And there were no effects on all of these things that you might also have worried about. There was a small effect on insulin secretion. It looked as though these people might possibly be marginally insulin resistant. It meant nothing whatever to them as 30-year-olds. What we don't know is whether it means they're slightly more at risk of diabetes as they get older. But they're perfectly well at 30. But by then there was another controversy raging. What about the women who are at risk of preterm birth, they get steroids, but then they don't deliver? And we knew by then that the effects are optimal for about a week. And in fact, Mont and Ross had said right at the beginning, if delivery doesn't happen and again threatens, therapy might need to be repeated. Well, over all this time, there had been some sheep studies showing indeed repeat doses do improve lung function. Lung function was better with more doses, but size was decreased. Steroids decreased fetal growth. And Barker's stuff had all said that that would be a bad thing. So we're back in the same problem. What happens? Now, during the whole of this time that I was doing sheep studies, Geoffrey Robinson was in Adelaide doing sheep studies, and he introduced me to Caroline Crowther and some more wine. And Caroline was doing multi-centre clinical trials, and she was foolish enough to take on this one of repeat doses of steroids and persuaded me for some reason to be part of it as well in Auckland. And That, plus a subsequent 9 trials, total of 10, we put together in a single review, over 5,000 babies. I think we can be reasonably confident that repeat steroids do indeed improve lung disease. They do improve outcomes for the baby. They don't have adverse effects on the mother. And they don't adversely affect growth and development, at least to early childhood. But people still weren't using them. They still don't want to use them because they're still worried about side effects. There's got to be problems later on. So you have to look later. So we set about looking later. And Chris McKinley came along as another paediatric trainee who was doing his PhD, and he got involved in the school-age follow-up, 6 to 8 years now. No effect on survival or intelligence or growth or cerebral palsy. But we were physiologists still at heart, and we still wanted to know about those things like insulin secretion and so on. So Chris did that as well. And in the New Zealand cohort, there was no effect on things like insulin, blood pressure, fat. Really looks pretty safe. And we will come back to that point, sorry. When Mont generously lent his name to the institute, the Liggins Institute, and Peter was appointed its first director, the Vice-Chancellor at the time who supported it all was John Hood. And I've treasured John's friendship for many years, since Oxford days. And it was he who first introduced me to the complexities of the wider university, the challenges of a huge juggernaut of an institution, like a big university. So when the opportunity arose, it was with his support and encouragement and a lot of trepidation that I took on the role of Deputy Vice-Chancellor for research. In theory, responsible for leading research across the whole of the university, which is, of course, completely impossible. But it was an immense privilege. I learned about some fascinating research in the huge range of disciplines that occurs within this university. And it was with great sadness that I bid farewell to these wonderful colleagues. We'd supported each other through all sorts of ups and downs. They were a reason to come to work as well as the babies. People ask me if I missed the clinical work. I did, and I always will. But I also had the privilege of learning to work with a different team of clever, committed, incredibly hard-working people, and Stuart McCutcheon in particular. His ongoing support and friendship made all the difference. To my great surprise, it turned out that medical training was just perfect training for a senior leadership role. All the things you learn in medicine about working with different disciplines, about trying to identify the cause, not the symptoms, multitasking, making decisions with no information and no resources, breaking bad news, and lots of communication. Actually, all those skills that you learn in medicine were absolutely essential for this kind of role. And it was when I acquired just a few more barnacles, a new title, a distinguished professor. This was a complete and overwhelming surprise, but it was also a recognition by my own colleagues and my own institution. And it probably meant more to me than anything else. When I was Deputy Vice-Chancellor, I was allowed to keep one day free for research, albeit not very successfully sometimes. But some of our more recent work has started to focus on low glucose levels. Why? Because low glucose levels are really common and they can cause brain injury. Lots of babies we test, lots of babies get admitted to the neonatal unit, it's expensive, and we still don't really know who to treat how. Now, I'd been interested in glucose since those very first days in Oxford when I showed you that diagram. And I always wanted to get onto this problem, but I knew it was too big and complicated. I'd never quite had the courage to tackle it. But we had some new techniques, some new skills like continuous glucose monitoring that started to make it look as though we might be able to get some traction on it. And the fact that babies drop their glucoses soon after birth is simply a function of somebody cuts the cord. The glucose from the mum stops coming, and the baby has to work out how to maintain its own glucose levels between meals, just like you and I did. And that takes sometimes 2 or 3 or 4 days. And it's not surprising some of them don't do it very well, and their glucoses go quite low before they sort it out. And Deborah Harris, at the beginning, not the end of her PhD where she is here, was a nurse practitioner from Hamilton, and she kept coming to talk to me about doing a PhD, and she kept saying, "Jane, I really want to do something that's going to make a difference to clinical practice. Give me a big, hard problem that'll make difference to clinical practice." So I said, if you'd really want something big and hard, let's tackle low glucoses. And at the time, the only way we had to treat low glucoses was to give babies formula or to put up a drip. And usually that involved admitting a baby to intensive care, separating mother and baby, miserable for everybody. Waikato Hospital was using a dextrose gel, a sugar gel, for treating these babies, but there was no evidence that it ever actually worked. So we set up the Sugar Babies study, and Deb led this with the support of Phil Weston in Waikato. And you probably can't see very well the dextrose gel. It's just a clear gel being squirted onto that finger, and then it gets rubbed inside the baby's cheek. It's very simple, straightforward, cheap, non-invasive. We managed to show that dextrose gel did work. The green bars are the babies who didn't get the dextrose gel, the white ones did, and you can see that the babies who got dextrose gel were much less likely to have treatment failure, that is, didn't get their blood glucoses up. They're much less likely to be admitted to intensive care for low glucoses, and they were less likely to be getting formula at 2 weeks of age. That was very exciting, and what was even more exciting is it got taken up around the world very quickly, and everybody who reported that they'd started using dextrose gel reported the same thing, that admissions to intensive care went down and breastfeeding went up. It's unbelievably rewarding to think that you've made that much difference to how these babies are managed around the world. And even better, Matt Glasgow, who's just finishing his PhD at the moment, along with Richard Edlin, have managed to show that it saves money. We don't have many treatments that save money. This one saves over $1,000 per baby. But we hadn't really solved the problem. The real problem is that we don't know what the long-term outcomes are. We don't know who gets brain damaged when. And Bill Hay, who's been another long-time mentor and supporter, published an agenda for the research years ago. And we foolishly, as always, thought, well, this can't be too hard. We had over 600 babies, the child study, who'd been born in Hamilton. We knew all about their glucoses, we knew how they'd been managed. And we thought, well, all we need to do is see how they grow up and develop, and we'll be able to answer that question. Wrong. We saw them at 2. And at 2, there was no difference between the babies that had low glucose and the ones who had. It was really quite disappointing. Another perfectly good idea ruined by the facts. But it's important not to give up. When we saw them at 4, in fact, the ones who'd had low glucoses had impaired visual motor function and impaired executive function. And it was worse if the low glucoses were more severe or more frequent. Visual motor function involves things like hand-eye coordination, and executive function involves the skills that allow you to do things like listen to instructions and sit still and pay attention. So we predicted that these children would be having trouble when they got to school, because those are pretty important skills to go to school. So we realised we had to look at them again when they went to school. We've just finished, or just finishing, Child 9. We've done MRIs on some of them to look at their brains. We've had a whole team of people going to schools and testing children using games on devices, because 9-year-olds really like devices. And I hope over the next few weeks and months we'll have some answers to that question. But at the same time, of course, there's always another question. We found in the child study that children who'd had low glucoses that we hadn't known about were still having problems with executive function when they were 4. And a team in Arkansas had shown that children who'd had just one low glucose came up, just one low glucose. They were half as likely to be proficient in reading and maths in 4th grade, that's about 10. And if that's right, then the best treatment in the world isn't going to solve the problem. We actually need to be focused on prevention. So again, the answer seemed perfectly simple. Could we use dextrose gel, which works so well to treat low glucoses, could we use it to prevent low glucoses? And as always, a simple question turns out to be much harder. To start with, you have to figure out what dose you're going to use. Is there a dose of gel that will prevent low glucose levels? We did a dosing study. Jo Hegarty did it for her PhD. More than 400 babies, took us 1.5 years. The answer was yes, you can reduce the incidence of low glucose with dextrose gel. But that's just a number. Does it actually matter? Could we keep babies out of intensive care? That's a harder question. You need over 2,000 babies. That means 18 centres across Australia and New Zealand. It took us 5.5 years. We've just finished that study. We hope to have the results out quite soon. But of course that doesn't answer the question either, because what you really want to know is, have you prevented the brain injury? And to find that out, as I've already told you, we have to look at them much later. We've seen 900 and something, Jenny will tell me, babies. 960, thank you, Jenny. Babies at 2, and we're just starting the 6-year study. And we've also just started embarking on a whole new program of research, because, as you will have heard, we've realised increasingly that what's happening around the time of birth and what we're doing to treat babies and families at that time is important. But what really matters is what happens in the long term. And this new program is set down for another 5 years, we'll see. We're going to look at children who've been in 3 trials, HPOT I've just told you about, and PROVIDE, that's a trial of protein in very preterm babies. We're going to see them at 6 or 7. Those children who were in the PET steroid trial, they're now going to be 20, and we're going to go back and see them. Those adults who Stuart saw at age 30, who had signs of insulin resistance, we want to know if they've got diabetes when they're 50. And excitingly, we've also got a component that's about trying to understand what families and communities think is important for those outcomes. We have some ideas about what we think might be affected, but what do families think is going to matter as these children grow up that we should be paying attention to? Those kinds of studies are not simple. You know, follow-up requires a really highly trained and dedicated team. They travel all around the country. They see children in schools, at home, in clinics, and they spend a lot of time away from home making it all happen. But we do in New Zealand have a real competitive advantage here. This is not work that people can be doing in other parts of the world. I don't know how to test for diabetes in a 50-year-old. I'm a paediatrician, for heaven's sake. Nor do I know what to ask the teachers about how these children are doing at school. We need people with lots of different skills to get together and plan it and understand what the answers are going to mean. And we need a fantastic bunch of students to be part of the team. And I know tonight there are some people at least dialed in, and perhaps some in the audience, who are hoping to join us to do their PhDs soon. We hope you will be here soon, and we're looking forward to having you. And if you're still thinking about it, there are lots of opportunities, and I know there are lots of wonderful projects on the website to have a look at. This kind of research is not simple. It needs wonderful people, staff and students. It needs very generous families, thousands of them who've been part of our studies, who've contributed their time and effort, who've had their babies participate. And they're making a difference to millions of babies around the world, even now and into the future. It couldn't be done without them. It needs very long time frames. I've been talking to you not about years, but about decades. And of course, all of that needs a lot of support, financial, time, and other. This has been a really interesting opportunity to look back, and I've been trying to think about what have I learned, what might I perhaps have told my younger self that I know now. I probably wouldn't have listened. Things don't go to plan. I think I've told you with some of the research that things don't go to plan. It is just faintly possible that I'm about to finish a project on time and on budget. And if that happens, it will be the first time in my entire career. Don't tell Frank. Cultivate resilience. Success the first time is very rare. My current record for having manuscripts rejected by journals is 4 on one day, and that's pretty depressing. But you just have to know that you have to pick yourself up and turn around and try again. Grab opportunities when they arise, even if the future is uncertain. You never know where they'll lead. You never know what you're going to learn along the way, and I certainly wouldn't have done all of what I've done without grabbing opportunities, thinking, oh, I'm not sure about this. And don't worry about the length of training. If you're doing what you really love, who cares if somebody says it's a training role? What matters to you is what matters. And treasure your colleagues. Your friends, your mentors, your supervisors will become your collaborators and your friends for life, and so will your students. And they'll teach you about all sorts of interesting things like wine and birds. This edition of A Few More Barnacles is, of course, a wonderful honour and celebration. But for me, it's also one of profound gratitude. I have been and are deeply privileged. I have a job that's deeply satisfying and challenges me every day to make a difference. I'm privileged to work with very talented students, colleagues, collaborators, friends, mentors. I'm privileged to be involved with families at that incredibly precious time, the birth of a baby. What could be more special than that? Thank you to everybody who's been part of the journey. You know who you are. You're too many to name, but no less special for that. Thank you to the people without whom none of it would have happened. And none of it would have mattered. I'm very grateful that it starts with babies. Thank you.
I'd now like to invite Stuart Dalziel to give a vote of thanks. Stuart is Professor of Paediatric Emergency Medicine at the University of Auckland, a Paediatric Emergency Medicine Consultant at Starship Children's Hospital, and is Cure Kids Chair Professor. Thank you, Stuart.
It is my absolute pleasure this evening to thank distinguished Professor Dame Jane Harding for her outstanding lecture tonight. And also to recognise on behalf of her colleagues, the university and the many thousands of infants who have benefited from her research and her care, her elevation to Dame Companion of the New Zealand Order of Merit. On a personal note, like Frank, I have known Jane as my supervisor and mentor since my first day starting work in Auckland 21 years ago. And it's certainly appropriate this evening that Frank introduced Jane and that I'm somewhere towards the end. You see, Frank handed in his PhD after 3 years and 1 day, the minimum amount of time for the University of Auckland for a PhD. I handed in mine after 4 years, the maximum amount of time at the University of Auckland. So I might have received, on just the odd occasion, one of Jane's legendary looks. But despite this, she is still talking to me, and it's a great privilege to call her a friend and a colleague. As you have heard, Jane has deservedly been awarded many honours and accolades over her career. And I'd like to highlight 2 of these again this evening. Jane has been awarded the Bevan Medal from the Health Research Council of New Zealand for excellence in translational research. That's research that makes a real difference at the bedside. Jane has been awarded the Rutherford Medal from the Royal Society of New Zealand, their most prestigious award. Both of these awards are for her preeminent research in determining the causes and the long-term consequences of interventions around birth, leading to new therapies, new understandings that affect millions of women and infants around the world. This evening, Jane, as always, has very eloquently explained sometimes very complicated issues to us all around those important events that occur early in life. Be that the importance of early fetal nutrition, be that protection offered by antenatal steroids, or the management and the complications around glucose in young infants. For those of you who are not paediatricians, let me reassure you that what Jane has discussed this evening is truly world class. Hundreds and thousands of babies have directly benefited from the research that you heard about this evening. This evening you heard about research that Jane has undertaken leading very large teams. And some members of those teams have gone on to very senior roles here at the university, but also around New Zealand and internationally. Others have never left Jane's side. And it's really the awe and the mana with which we all hold her that so many of these people are either in the room tonight or actually in the new COVID world that we live in on Zoom. And throughout her career, Jane has continually provided us with an inspirational role model in academic medicine. Yet she remarkably has always had time to listen, no matter how small the problem, be that over coffee or indeed over wine. Jane's considerate, caring nature has not only been for the families and the infants that she's been looking after in the neonatal unit, but also for the many of us who've had the privilege of working for her. Tonight, Jane, we thank you. We thank you for your stellar research. We thank you for the friendship and leadership that you have given us. We thank you for your care and support. we thank you for the inspiration that you have been to many. Jane's title tonight was "It All Starts with Babies." For many of us, it all starts with Jane. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like you to join with me once again in thanking Jane for an excellent lecture this evening, but also to congratulate her on the well-deserved and outstanding achievement in being made a Dame Companion of the New Zealand Order of Merit. Jane.
I have two final small tasks before we all prepare for refreshments. The first is to be here on behalf of the Perinatal Society of Australia and New Zealand, an organisation that is very close to Jane's heart and one that she has contributed to in many ways over many years as a contributor to the meetings, as mentors for members of the society, and as leadership in the society, particularly as its president for a couple of years after she oversaw the union of the Perinatal Society of New Zealand with the Perinatal Society of Australia, the latter being the younger of the two societies, by the way. And on behalf of the current president of the Perinatal Society of Australia and New Zealand, Tim Moss, and its previous president, Lynn Sinclair, who are both on Zoom this evening, many, many congratulations, Jane, and a small gift from them for you. And then finally, just from the Liggins Institute, a small gift to thank you for another absolutely outstanding lecture. Having heard Jane's lecture, would anyone like to guess what's in the box? So now just remains to invite you all to join us for refreshments outside, and thank you all very much for coming, and thank you also very much to all of those who've joined from Zoom from around the world. We're very grateful to have you here. Just a shame you're not here in person. Thank you very much.